بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين وإمام المرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I hope you're all well. Today is a new session that we've started for this particular online series, but it's an older session that we're reviving. A few years ago, I think possibly 2014, I started a discourse on commentary of the Qasida al-Burda or Qawaqib al-Durriya fi Madh al-Khayr al-Bariya of Imam al-Busiri. And we ran around 4-5 sessions maybe, and then we stopped because I was busy with other things. And I want to, inshallah, every Saturday now revive that particular lesson and continue with my commentary on the Burda. Prior to that, I think in the year of 2010 or 11, I had taught the whole entire commentary of the Qasida, and but it wasn't recorded. Now today, inshallah, I want to introduce the poem for those who are not familiar with it, or if you're familiar with it, just a background of what I intend to cover and what we've covered so far. In the previous recordings, I think they can be found on YouTube. I think I covered up to line 6 or 7, up to the verse نعم سرى طيف من أهوى فأرقني والحب يعترض اللذات بالألم. But for these sessions, inshallah, I'm going to start from chapter 2, and I will explain why in a few minutes. But first, I want to introduce the poem and the importance of the poem and its kind of legacy in Islamic history. The Burda of Busiri, or the Bur'a of Busiri, a famous poem, panegyric poem that praises the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, but it's much greater than that, much more than that. It contains chapters on various different topics, all in some way or another related to either Busiri or Busiri's relationship with the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, or the Messenger of God and his great attributes. This poem is sung throughout the world. Mainly its chorus, although the chorus isn't part of the poem itself, but it became kind of a historic feature of the poem, an attachment to the poem that everybody recites Mawla salli wa sallim da'iman abada ala habibika khayl khalqi kullihim, and its various other iterations. And you can get more of that, more information about that on my previous lessons on the Burda. Now I do think it's an incredible poem to comment on because each chapter offers us something different. It has a different theme, and each theme is slightly is related to the Messenger of God but in different ways, and we'll find out about that today. Chapter 1, which I won't be covering, I've already covered some of it previously, and you can watch those recordings, talked about Busiri's journey and a discussion of this kind of relationship between him and the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, although he speaks to himself in the third person, or in the second person, sorry. He's speaking to himself. And the purpose of that chapter is to talk about his current state and the state of affairs of a person who is truly in love and has a deep attachment to the Messenger of God and the state that they're in. Just some notes on Busiri as a person. He was a great poet. Although he started off as a poet that was known for praising leaders and people of power and making money from that, he later then left that way of life and felt that he would now praise the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he discusses that in his poem and talks about how he has amassed all this kind of chest of sins in praising these people, and that he has now left of all of that, and he's to praise the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. This poem actually, this differed upon what its nickname is. Some say it's the Burda, the cloak. Others say it's al-Bur'a, the cure. Both are viable and possible. I prefer Bur'a, the cure, because it's more in line with what happened to him. He was paralyzed, and he had a dream of the Messenger of God, and Allah had cured him. When he awoke, he was cured from that disability or the problem that he had prior. What I'm going to do is, inshallah, I want to start from the second chapter, and it's actually really pertinent as well that we probably start from that. The reason I'm leaving the remainder of the first chapter out is because I just want a fresh start from a new chapter. And I think the themes in chapter 2 are kind of important right now for where we're at with the lockdown and what's currently going on. Chapter 2 is incredible in that it discusses a dimension of spirituality. It's more about the state of man and the spiritual state of man. And Busiri plays on his own state as well. And it talks about the nafs and how the nafs is weak and how the nafs is easily misguided. And it talks about different elements of the nafs. And I'm going to start, inshallah, today with 3 lines only for the whole session and concentrating on line 1 and what Busiri's intention was when he introduced this chapter. First and foremost, I think he introduces this chapter trying to highlight his own struggles. Busiri has these struggles like any human being does. And one needs to overcome these struggles to really build a good relationship with Allah and His Messenger. That's the primary reason. And he begins, and I'm just going to start with the first line, inshallah ta'ala, and begin slowly to commentate on that. He writes, and I would recommend that you have a good translation of the Burda. The one that I will always recommend to everybody is this particular translation of the Burda. You should be able to purchase it on Amazon, I think. It's translated by Aziza Spiker, a person who's very, very dear to me. And she's done an excellent job in producing this work, this translation. It's a very simple translation, and it comes also with the full transliteration. And that's the one that I do recommend. I'm sure there are other excellent publications out there as well, but this is the one that I particularly recommend. He begins in chapter 2 and he states, فَإِنَّ أَمَّارَةِ بِالسُّوءِ مَتَعْضَتْ مِنْ جَهْلِهَا بِالنَّذِيرِ الشَّيْبِ وَالْهَرَمِ, which translates as my foolish, reckless self refused to heed the warning heralded by the onset of grey hair and old age. And I really want to talk about that, this particular line and why it's so important, very important for me as well. I bought this one of my favorite lines in the Burda. This line is an introduction to Busiri's state of affairs, and it begins with this idea or motif, this idea of grey hair. He continues on from the previous line in Ittahamtu Nasiha Shayb, and he builds on that. And the idea is about grey hair, and I want to introduce this idea of grey hair first. Grey hair has historically, or in the Islamic tradition, been symbolic of closeness to death. There's a story of Sayyidina Umar, and when he was the Khalifa, there was a man that would come outside of his house, and he would, whenever he would leave the house, the man would stand there and say, Ittaqillaha ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, fear God, or be fearful of God, O leader of the believers. Now, it's a very odd thing to say, because you would expect the leader of the believers and the faithful is somebody who is aware of God and God conscious. And even it had a level you could argue of su'ul adab, of bad adab with Amir al-Mu'mineen, of a man so great as Sayyidina Umar, but he would never take it in that way. He would just accept it, and he would say thank you, shukran, he would walk away. But one day he came out of his house, Sayyidina Umar, and the man said it, and he reacted differently to every other day. He responded, I wouldn't say harshly, but with a particular tone. And he said to him that, never again say that to me. And he said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, every day I come here, you've never minded before, you've never said anything before to me. And I've said, Ittaqillah ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, every day of the year. And why now? What's changed? And he called him closer and he said, look at this. And he had some grey hair, maybe in his beard or maybe in the hair on his head. And he said, look at this. He said, this hair, this shade, this is enough to remind me of death. I don't need you anymore. This is enough to remind me of taqwa. And there's always this symbolic idea of grey hair reminding us that it's now the beginning of the next kind of journey in our lives, a journey where we are more serious about our relationship with God. And you often see in certain communities, take the subcontinent community, even when they get to a particular age, whatever they did as younger people, when they get to a particular age, they almost begin to go to the masjid, pray, and kind of leave that particular way of life. Sayyidina Ibrahim in the Quran, for instance, he has grey hair, and he says to Allah, "Oh Allah, what is this? What are these hairs?" And Allah says they're of dignity. That's dignity. And the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, in some hadith infers that one shouldn't spoil their grey hair. Allah knows that some of these hadith are weak, others are a bit stronger, about one not spoiling grey hair. And there's a whole legal issue around should one is one allowed to dye their grey hair or white hair the same color as their normal hair, or black. And there's a fiqh discussion about that. Ibn Ajiba has a good entry for that in his commentary of the Burda, and say some of the Sahaba were okay with it, and Sayyidina Umar, he adds as one of them. But other schools, for instance, Hanafi school is quite stringent about it, about its kind of impermissibility to a degree anyway. But that's a matter of Islamic law. Now, he says, Rahimullah Ta'ala, فَإِنَّ أَمَّارَةِ بِالسُّوءِ مَتَعَذَتْ. And I want to break that down and discuss that to a degree, inshallah. He says, فَإِنَّ أَمَّارَةِ, my foolish, reckless self has refused to heed. فَإِنَّ أَمَّارَةِ بِالسُّوءِ مَتَعَذَتْ. Now, very interestingly, this kind of wording is a play on the verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in Surah Yusuf, Inna nafsa la'ammaratun bisu. I want to talk about that and the play on these words, ammara. The word ammara means to be commanded by something, ammara. Su in Arabic means evil. In this particular verse in the Quran, we'll get to the speaker in a second, but it states that indeed the nafs, the self, you could translate the nafs as one soul even, is commanded by evil, or is constantly commanded by evil. The question is, who is Allah talking about in this particular verse in Surah Yusuf? The scholars differ. Some of the ulama state that this is in relation to, or the speaker here is Zulaykha. Bear in mind, in Surah Yusuf, Zulaykha's name is never mentioned ever in that surah, and the scholars differ over what her name is. Some say it's Zulaykha, some say it's Ra'il, they differ. But the majority of Mufassirun, including Imam Baydawi and others, Imam Baghawi as well, have mentioned that the speaker here is Sayyidina Yusuf himself, the Prophet Joseph, who states that Inna nafsa la'ammaratun bisu, that indeed the nafs is commanded by evil. Now, he wasn't speaking about himself at all. Rather, it's an indication of what the soul is like, the nature of the soul. And I'm going to get to why he could not have been speaking about himself in a short while. The nature of the soul, that it is commanded by evil, number one. And if you look at the context of the surah, it's more related to his humility in front of God, that Allah Jalla wa'ala saved him from this tribulation, and it was God that saved him, and he didn't want to attribute it to himself. Rather, he's saying that if it's the soul alone, then the soul is commanded by evil, but the intervention of God prevents the soul from falling into deep to problems and into sin. And I want to look at the different degrees of the soul, inshallah, today as a point, and then move on to the other lines. One of the greatest commentaries on the Burda, and there are many great commentaries, but two in my estimation that stand out more than all others. The first one is by the great Kharputi, Ahmad al-Kharputi, who was a Turkish scholar, and the other by Ibn Maklash, which is a very relatively unknown commentary, Ibn Maklash's commentary. But I would argue now it's the best commentary on the Burda. And I want to look at some of the entries for both. The great scholar Al-Kharputi mentions that the soul has different degrees, that all of us in this world, our soul or our nafs, and I want to quickly mention or briefly mention the difference between the idea of ruh and nafs. The scholars historically, and even now when the discussions of consciousness come up, there's a huge discussion about the human soul. But in Arabic, when is the word nafs used and when is the word ruh used? According to Kharputi, the word ruh is more in relation to the pure soul before it entered the body. And he argues that the nafs is the aftermath almost. that the soul becomes the nafs because it has desires, bodily desires, and things of that nature. And then when it surpasses or traverses beyond those bodily desires, it becomes ruh again. Now, when talking about the nafs, the self, and many famous psychoanalysts and psychologists and experts historically have talked about the idea of ego and id, and is it the devil self? What is it that commands us to evil? Why is it that we do things that are destructive, knowing they're destructive? What pushes us to that? So is it the shadow self? Is it the id? What is it? And Kharputi mentions the different degrees, and it begins with the first degree, as mentioned by Busiri, an-nafs amara bisu. And he writes that an-nafs amara bisu huwa allati tamilu ila at-tabi'a al-badaniyya wa ta'muru bil-ladhati wal-shahawat al-hissiyya. That this type, and it's the lowest, most, you could say spiritually the lowest form of self or state or degree of the soul. He writes that it's the degree that it conforms with its bodily desires outright. So it conforms with, or it gives into, or it inclines towards bodily desires. And they can be, and you can, the Ghazali mentioned that the most, Ghazali mentioned that the most severe of those two are food and sensual desire. Now, he goes on to mention other degrees, but on that note, I want to mention a few things. The great scholar of Azhar, who passed away in, if I'm correct, around the 40s, Sheikh Abdul Khaliq al-Shabrawi, wrote a very short tract or book on the soul, and it has unbelievable benefits. This particular book, it's translated into English as well. You can buy the English. It's the English is called Degrees of the Soul. It's translated by Sheikh Mustafa al-Badawi. It's an excellent translation, and he talks about the different degrees of the soul. And I want to mention two of them from his book, and it's the first two. And he talks about this first type, the one that's commanded or inclines towards evil, and he calls it the inciting soul. And he talks about different elements of that soul. And he writes that this inciting soul is the rational soul and the heart, of which God the Exalted says, "This is for those possessed of a heart. It is not the piece of flesh that is meant, but the lordly, subtle thing. However, when it becomes impure because of its inclination to its material nature, finds rest in its appetites, and consorts with appetitive soul, or the appetitive soul, or vital spirit, it rejoins the rank of animals, and its praiseworthy attributes are changed into blameworthy ones." The ulama generally mention of spirituality that this type of soul is the worst. Why? Because when the human being has two elements. It has its angelic dimension, and it has its bestial dimension, animal dimension. And the lowest form of the soul is that when it gives into its animal or bestial kind of nature, and then all it thinks about is those things. Material, for instance, is at the forefront of that. Later we're going to see food is also at the forefront of that. And this is the worst form of soul. And later in Busiri's poem in the Burda, Busiri talks about food, for instance. He talks about food, he talks about sensual desire, talks about other things as well. He moves on, rahimullah ta'ala, al-Kharputi, and he says the second type of soul, وَثَانِيَةُ النَّفْسُ اللَّوَّامَةُ. And nafs al-lawama is very interesting. It's the soul. The word lawama comes from the word lawm in Arabic, which means to blame or to censure. The soul that blames itself or recognizes its own mistakes to some degree. So nafs al-lawama وهي التي تنورت بنور القلب. This soul moves on from those animal desires, and is filled with some light. It has some light in it. And he writes that it's a soul that still falls into sin, but it has a certain form of realization, and it feels a sense of guilt. And I want to talk about those three things: this idea of guilt, recognition what they call i'tiraf in Arabic, and guilt, and then what one should do after that, according to the scholars of spirituality. Sheikh Shabrawi talks about it and talks about it as a reproachful soul. Now we have to ask ourselves, which of these two, at the very least, what rank are we? Are we the soul that's given into animal desires or animal appetites and have left any form of spirituality? Or have we reached the station and that's the question Busiri is also asking to a degree, of the reproachful soul. Sheikh Shabrawi states that there may remain traces of the inciting soul in it, meaning in this particular rank of soul, there may still be some elements of the first level still remaining. Yet despite these, it is able to acknowledge truth as truth and falsehood as falsehood, and recognize its attributes as blameworthy. Meaning this is the level where one begins to realize, okay, I make mistakes, I do things that are wrong, I recognize that they are wrong. Then he moves on to a very interesting subcategory of the soul, and this is incredibly interesting. He writes that this particular type of soul, a nafsu lawama, can even reach a rank where they pray all of their prayers, they are up for the night vigil, they're up for tahajjud, they fast additionally as well, and are to a degree quite righteous. But yet he says there are other problems that are hidden beneath. One may think that, okay, I've reached a rank here and that rank is sufficient now. But he writes that this particular type of soul is one of the most dangerous. And he has he compares it to a particular type of tree. He says, think about a particular tree. This tree is an evil tree, and it bears a poisonous fruit. And think about this soul to be the following. A group of people arrive and they see this tree, so they want to stop the evil of this tree, the poisonous, the growing of this poisonous fruit. So what they do is they cut all the branches off the tree, and they think they've solved the problem. But yet the water source, it remains, and the tree's trunk, it still remains, or the tree's center still remains. He says, what will happen to that tree? Over time, the branches will grow back and it'll bear fruit again. And then they'll have to cut it off again. And then it'll bear fruit again. He said, these people will never reach a level where they are free from the problem, because all they've merely done is they've not solved the problem, they've not cured the illness, they've just temporarily cut off the problem. And he says this is the similarity or similitude of nafsul lawama. He writes, which was I found very, very interesting about this soul. He writes the following. He writes that good actions are performed, night vigil, fast, and so on, but these are contaminated with conceit and secret ostentation, meaning that even though they perform them, their illness is actually the fact that they want to be praised and they have a secret ostentation, an element of showing off. The possessor of such a soul conceals his good actions and acts for God, yet he loves others to find out about his actions. He loves to be praised and lauded for his acts, yet he detests this tendency, meaning this soul accepts that he hates doing that, but cannot get over the fact that he's doing it. Meaning there's a recognition there, which he recognizes for himself, and is unable to erase it entirely from his heart. To erase it entirely would mean that he is sincere and secure. However, even sincere people are still in grave danger, since they live to know, since they like to know that they are sincere for this, that they are sincere, and this itself amounts to a secret ostentation. As for open ostentation, means showing off publicly, it is to act for the sake of being seen by others. This is then hidden idolatry that the Messenger of God talked about. And then he goes on to document the different degrees of ostentation, all of those hadith about showing off publicly and its harms. About showing off itself, we know the famous story of Bayezid Bustami and the dangers of it. Now, the third type of soul, the soul after this, you could say now is the beginning of goodness, the beginning of the kind of great levels. وثالث النفس المطمئنة وهي التي تنورت بنور القلب حتى تخلت عن صفاتها الذميمة. He writes that the third rank, Kharputi writes, of the soul is النفس المطمئنة, the soul that has reached a state of tranquility and peace. هي التي تنورت, it's full of light, or the heart is full of light. And the reason he mentions this is because the first type of soul has no light whatsoever. It's merely controlled by animal desires. He says, حتى تخلت عن صفاتها الذميمة, that it's now rid itself of all of its dispraised qualities. The fourth type then he mentions, the type after that, and this Shabrawi mentions as a third type, but Kharputi puts as the fourth type, is a nafs al-mulhama, is the nafs that is inspired by God, is the fourth type. And it's the type وهي التي ألهمها الله العلم والتواضع والقناعة والسخاوة, that this is the soul that has been inspired. And two things that he mentions are particularly important with the ilm, al-ilm wa tawadu, knowledge of God, and tawadu, and humility. Humility is one of those things, unfortunately, that is the hardest thing to achieve for all people. They say that Bab al-Tawadu is the emptiest, or the door of humility on the Day of Judgment has very few people there sitting at that door. Humility and being humble is a very, very difficult thing. And that's why we see prophets being the most humble of people. They said about the Messenger of God, as Imam Tirmidhi narrates in his Shama'il, that the Messenger of God was more shy than a woman, a virgin who is married, a veiled virgin on her wedding night. That he was incredibly shy, the Messenger of God, and incredibly humble, even though God had favored him to be the greatest of all mankind and the greatest of all God's creation, yet how humble he was. And the greatest scholars that you meet often, and the greatest people generally, are the people that you love the most, are the ones that are the most humble, that are not arrogant, that don't show off, that have very little ostentation in them. And the worst people are the ones who we find as arrogant. In fact, arrogance is seen as the most manifest attribute of the devil. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when talking about the devil in the Quran, states, Aba wastakbara, that he refused to accept the command of God, wastakbara, and he kind of elevated himself, became arrogant, wa kana min al-kafirin. He was from those who had rejected God's ni'mah. And he writes that this nafs is the nafs that now is endowed with this. And he said, how does that manifest? What is the manifestation? What are the signs of this inspiration from God, this inspired soul? He writes, فَلِذَا كَانَتْ مَنْبَأُ الصَّبْرِ وَالتَّحَمُّلِ وَالشُّكْرِ, that three things he mentions, that the person now has sabr and tahammul and shukr, the ability to take on things, and shukr, to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also. Then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, the fifth type of self or soul, وَالنَّفْسُ الرَّاضِيَةِ, it's the nafs that God is pleased with, the nafs al-radiyah. وَهِيَ الَّتِي رَضِيَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَنْهَا, and God mentions the Sahaba to be from this type in the Quran. And not only is God pleased, a sign of that pleasure of God is left within the heart of the believer, that manifests itself in different ways. The next type that the Shaykh mentions is an-nafsul mardiyya, that now the soul realizes that God is pleased with it, and the soul is pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he writes, a manifestation of this state is al-asrar bayn Allahi wa baynaha, that between God and this soul, many secrets are now unraveled, or many things are open for this particular person. And then he writes, rahimullah ta'ala, that prophets are one beyond this. Prophets and their souls are beyond this, as Ibn Qayyim mentions, rahimullah ta'ala, in Kitab al-Ruh, that the messenger of God's soul is as expansive as the cosmos, that the souls of prophets are beyond this. They have no element of this. They're in divine communion. Now he mentions something very, very interesting. And he says, okay, who's these particular souls? Who do they represent? What types of people does each category represent? And he says the following. He said the first type, that's commanded by animal instincts and commanded by evil, the enticed soul, you could call it. These are the souls of the disbelievers and the shayateen and the fasiqeen, the people who have left God's way, essentially, whichever category that they fit into. He said the second type of soul is that person who's other than somebody who transgresses the bounds of God. And they are from the believers also. I mean, the believers can be from both types, but these are people who are not what they call al-fasiqeen, and the people who have struggled and stopped committing major sins now, openly, that is. What's incredible is that the Messenger of God mentioned this era, and I'm not here to preach to anybody to tell people to everybody's on a spiritual journey, and everybody goes through a particular time when they may sin, and everybody struggles with that element. But what I would like to say is that we should never see sin as something small. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna nadama tawba, inna tawba nadama." In a better reading of it, "Inna nadama tawba," that indeed guilt is a sign of, or is repentance itself. The Messenger of God said, alayhi salatu wasalam, that one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is that people will lose an element of guilt for sin, that they will see as nothing. And we live in that day, unfortunately, and we ask Allah for forgiveness and mercy in that regard. And we shouldn't see sin as, even if we do commit sin, we ask Allah for ease and for forgiveness. But yet we shouldn't see it as something small. We should still recognize. And the last stage is where one relinquishes that kind of connection, where one doesn't even recognize it as something major anymore. And he writes, therefore, the nafs lawama, the nafs, self-critical nafs, is actually one for the believers. And they're people who don't sin publicly, but they have that internal element and that struggle, as mentioned by Imam Shabrawi. The third type, he writes, the nafs mutma'inna, that is, the soul that has tranquility. He writes, is nafs al-muta'allimin al-alimin. That it's of those who are seekers now. Those who are seekers, I would call, seekers of God's way. The fourth type, he writes, are the third type, those who are tranquil, are students of the spiritual path. The ones from all of us. I'm not talking about in terms of orders or anything of that. I'm talking about anybody this can be who is seeking God and on that spiritual path. Even in and of themselves, they are just trying to better themselves. The third type, he says, the fourth type, the souls that are endowed with this inspiration from God, are al-muta'allimin, al-amilin, are the teachers who those who educate other people, not teachers of Sharia necessarily. We're talking about people who can now help other people with spirituality, and who are amilin, are those who practice the way themselves. The fifth type of soul, as we mentioned before, the nafs al-radiya, the pleased soul, are the souls or degrees or stations of the awliya, the guardians, the people of God, the elect, or the people of God. The sixth type, mardiya an-nafs al-arifin, the elect of the spiritual class. And he says what's beyond that are the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now I want to mention an entry of Ibn Ajiba, which I find really wonderful. And that's to do with considering that this particular line is about Busiri saying that the context of the line is as follows. He now has grey hair, and these grey hairs are a reminder. And he writes that even though I have grey hair, the soul commands to evil and ignores the sign of death upon my head, meaning the sign that these grey hairs have given me that my time is near, that the evil soul, the soul that commands or entices one towards evil, it even ignores these very, very clear signs. And Ibn Ajiba mentions a story which I find to be fascinating, interesting story about Bani Israel, about a young man. And he writes that وَرُوِيَ أَنَّ شَابًا فِي بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل عَبِدَ اللَّهَ 20 سَنَةً, that there was a young man, that he worshipped God for 20 years. He was from the children of Israel. Allah knows best about if the story is true, but the meaning is very good. وَاجْتَهَدَ ثُمَّ عَصَاهُ 20 سَنَةً. So he worshipped God for 20 years, and then he struggled with that, and then he began to sin, and he sinned for 20 years. And not only did he sin, but he fell into all sorts of sin, the worst of sins. He nosedived into sin. One day, he looked at his reflection. فَرَآ الشَّيْبَ فِي وَجْهِهِ. And he saw grey hair in his beard. And that really displeased him. And not only that, وَأَشْفَقَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. He began to pity himself. Like we talked about the nafs lawama before. ثُمَّ قَالَ. He said, "O Allah, Ilahi, my Lord, أَطَعْتُكَ 20. I served you, I worshipped you, I obeyed you for 20 years. وَعَسَيْتُكَ 20 سَنَةً. I disobeyed you for 20 years. He said, فَإِنْ رَجَعْتُ إِلَيْكَ. If I, God, only if I now return to you. If I return to you, I know it's been these 20 years of sin. Will you accept me if I return to you after these 20 years of sin? فَهَتَفَ بِهِ هَاتِفٌ. He hears a sound, a voice. Could be a vision that he sees, or maybe in his sleep he saw this. And he heard the voice. And the voice said, أَحْبَبْتَنَا فَأَحْبَبْنَاكَ. We loved you, or rather, you loved us. You showed love for God. فَأَحْبَبْنَاكَ. And we loved you. وَتَرَكْتَنَا. And you left us. فَتَرَكْنَاكَ. And we left you. وَعَسَيْتَنَا. And you disobeyed us. فَأَمْهَلْنَاكَ. So he says, Allah says that you disobeyed us. فَأَمْهَلْنَاكَ. But yet we gave you time. وَإِنْ رَجَعْتَ إِلَيْنَا. If you come back now, we will accept you. And that's an incredibly wonderful kind of story about Tawbah. That this man for 20 years after sinning just pleaded to Allah, if I return now, will you accept me? And God went through the same phases. When you loved us, we loved you. When you left us, we left you. When you sinned, we left that door open. Amhalnak. We gave you time. And now that you want to come back, the door is open for you. And that's the meaning of Busiri's line. He states in the second part of that, in the Misra, the second part, min jahliha bin nadhir shaybi wal haram bil harami. Heralded by the onset of grey hair and old age, meaning you refuse to heed the warning of old age and grey hair. In the next line, he states, وَلَا أَعَدَّتْ مِنَ الْفَعْلِ الْجَمِيلِ قِرَى ضَيْفٍ أَلَمَّ بِرَأْسِ غَيْرَ مُحْتَشِمِ. Some really interesting points about this line. It's translated as, and it had not prepared any good deeds to properly welcome this guest who had turned up on my head unannounced. Meaning, if I had known that you were coming, I would have prepared something for you. What does he mean? Ghazali talks about this idea of the age of 40, that 40 is a turning point in one's life of when we reach that age. And I'm just on the edge of that, just a couple of years away. That he talks about that this is the age where after which either you're set in your ways or you are finally turned to God, turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says that's the most important age. It's also the age of wahi. And he writes that if I had known you were coming, I would have definitely prepared good deeds for you. If I knew that death was coming, and later he qualifies this by saying that, oh Allah, I haven't prepared much, however. And I'm going to go into that line when it comes, inshallah ta'ala. Now, this particular line, which is interesting, is not actually from the Burda. The second line, or the second hemistage, Dayfin, Alamma bi ra'si ghayra muhtashimi, this guest who had turned up on my head unannounced. This is not by Busiri. This is not Busiri's line. He did not write this line. This line actually was written by the great poet Mutanabbi. And he writes, Dayfun alamma bi ra'si ghayra muhtashimi wa shaybu ahsanu fa'lin minhu bil limami. And the question is, why did Busiri copy his line? Now, Ibn Maqlash was such a great scholar, that he pointed this out, and he said that he argues that Busiri didn't copy the line. He did not want to hide it from the people that he's taken on Mutanabbi. Rather, he's almost quoting Mutanabbi. He adds one of Mutanabbi's lines into his poem because it makes more sense. Because the question is, can you copy somebody's lines of poetry and attribute it to yourself? And he says, no, that's a far cry from that. Rather, he quotes Mutanabbi, and he says poets do this quite often. They will quote each other in their lines to complete that particular line. But the question is, for all of us here, and Kharputi does play on this a little bit, that how much have we prepared for those grey hairs? Some of us get them earlier than others, and others later, but what have we prepared? He continues and states, لو كنت أعلم أني ما أوقره كتمت سرا بدا لي منه بالكتم. If I had known that I could not receive him with honor, لو كنت أعلم أني ما أوقره, meaning these grey hairs, كتمت سرا, I would have hidden my secret from him with dye, meaning I would have dyed my hair. Meaning if I knew that I wouldn't be ready right now, I would not be ready for this, the onset of these grey hairs, death is coming, then I would have hidden. And this is his complaint, that I am at no position in my life. He felt it's a sense of humility from Busiri, saying that only if I had prepared more, it's a lament, only if I had prepared more before I got to this age to present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at the words that he uses. He considers them to be min al-fa'li al-jamili qira, in the previous line, any good deeds, min jamili qira, that he writes that I would have definitely prepared more for that. Now I want to kind of talk a little bit about this idea of grey hair and Busiri's, why does he play on this so much, and what did the Prophet ﷺ say about that? I want to mention a few words. But before I do, I want to talk about the idea of jahl. Earlier, Imam al-Busiri mentions that it's due to, the soul doesn't take warning from, because due to its ignorance. And there are essentially two types of ignorance. There's a type of ignorance with jahl basit and jahl murakkab. And we ask Allah that Allah that Allah protects us from jahl murakkab. One may say that we're all ignorant to some degree, but there's always a point that we don't know. That's not what Busiri is talking about. Because there are always things that we don't know and we come to know, and that's forgivable to a certain degree. But what when we know, but yet our nafs encourages us to go against that which we know? This is called jahl murakkab, the idea where we know we're wrong, or we know that we shouldn't be doing something, but yet we do it. And Busiri is stating that the worst state to be in is when we have grey hairs or receive grey hair, meaning when we approach old age, that we shouldn't be in a state, or our state of spiritual affairs shouldn't be such that we reject that particular sign. And we reject it because we're obstinate. We reject it because we're just unwilling to let go of the dunya. I'm going to conclude on some points here because I intended only to cover these three lines, and I want to talk a little about this, inshallah ta'ala. I want to conclude on these three lines now, inshallah. And I want to mention a few important things of what we're going to head on to next lesson, and why this poem is so important. One of the main purposes that I started this chapter, where I started the kind of the relaunch for the commentary on the Burda at this chapter. The second chapter of the Burda is one of the most important for all of us. Our connection with ourselves, have we recognized and realized our own weaknesses, our own ailments, our own maladies, our own diseases? And the reason I want to start this chapter, this relaunch here, was because this wakes us up to the current state of affairs that we're in, of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Busiri had reached a particular age, and that age was informing him of closeness to God. We have been given another blessing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of seclusion. And this seclusion, the disease, of course, we don't call a blessing necessarily. A disease is a disease, an illness, a virus is a virus. We ask for Allah's forgiveness. But it's given us an opportunity to reflect, such an opportunity that probably will not reach us in any other part of our lifetime. And Busiri was an interesting person because, and I wanted to reflect on this a little, Busiri had been part of the dunya. He had been in a state where he was considered a great singer, you could say, a great artist, a man who everybody would open their ears for. He would open his ears for. They would sing his poetry in the court of the leaders. He would get lots of money for it. He would get praise. He came to a point in his life where nothing else was left for him to achieve, and he felt the dunya had burdened him. There's a story that he mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, that's mentioned by the great Kharputi. He writes that Busiri one day went to praise a leader, and this may have been his story of reformation. And he walked in, and there was an old man sitting in the court, you could say, or maybe been a very big house. And Busiri is getting ready to praise this leader or this famous person. And the old man says to him, he says, "Did you see the messenger of God yesterday or last night in your dream?" Very odd question to ask anybody, actually. And he says, "No, I didn't see the messenger of God." And he leaves it at that. And Busiri says, I went home and I felt something missing from my heart, that why would he ask me such a question? And he said, by the evening, I was at a state of complete overwhelming yearning to see the messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. And he said, on that night, I saw the messenger of God in my dream. And that was the turning point where he changes everything. He still, incredibly, he lived on in a complete life of poverty after that. And that proves the hadith of the messenger of God, where the companion came to him and said, "Oh, messenger of God, I love you." And he said, "Be careful of what you say." And he said it 3 times, thrice. And the messenger of God said, "Whoever truly loves me, or if what you're claiming is true, then poverty will come to you faster than the tide comes to shore." Meaning it's just the way of the lovers. And Busiri suffered, it seems, from his diwan and other works, that he lived a poor life, but his love for the messenger of God grew, alayhi salatu, and we're going to experience that inshallah through this poem. And I hope that what we achieve because some would say, why have you selected a poem? Why don't you talk about Quran? We have a lesson for Quran on Tuesdays for those people who may have that kind of misgiving. Because Busiri's poem is a great platform to talk about many different things. And I want to talk about each line in detail and what he intended by those lines. And each line gives a different dimension. And this particular chapter, I'm going to cover in another 2 lessons, I hope. And lines such as كم حسنت لذة للمرء قاتلة من حيث لم يدري أن السم في الدسم. How often a pleasure that is in fact deadly has seemed good to one who does not know that they may be poison in the fat. That these lines are lines that really will allow me to talk about certain hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and ayat of the Quran that talk about how much we've fallen in our relationship with God and His Messenger. And in terms of the Messenger, we'll see how much we've fallen in that contract that we had with him, alayhi salatu wasalam, that we're not fulfilling those covenants with the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. And may Allah forgive all of us, and may Allah give us a closer relationship with the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم وأتوب إليه ولسائر المسلمين.